Donald Trump spent more than a year telling Canada that July 1st would be the moment everything changed. Again and again, the date was presented as a turning point, a deadline, a pressure point, a day when Canada would finally have to make a choice. The message was repeated so consistently that many people stopped questioning it. July 1st was coming, the clock was ticking, and according to Washington's narrative, Canada was running out of room to maneuver. But there was one problem. The deadline everyone was talking about may never have existed in the way it was being described, because the trade agreement at the center of this dispute doesn't actually expire on July 1st. Legally, it can't. The framework remains in place. The protections remain active. The rules continue to operate exactly as they were designed to. And here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The very mechanism preventing the agreement from collapsing wasn't created by Canada. It was created during Donald Trump's own renegotiation of North American trade. In other words, the same provision that was supposed to strengthen Washington's leverage may now be limiting Washington's ability to use that leverage the way many expected. Canada understood this. Mark Carney understood it too. And once you understand that single detail, many of Canada's decisions over the last year begin to look very different. While headlines focused on tariffs, warnings, and political drama, Canadian officials appeared to be preparing for something entirely different behind the scenes. They weren't acting like a government standing at the edge of a cliff. They were acting like a government preparing for a long game, and as the review date approaches, the gap between political messaging and legal reality is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The question is no longer whether July 1st changes everything. The real question is whether it changes much of anything at all. And the answer may explain why Mark Carney has remained remarkably calm while Washington continued escalating its rhetoric. Because in major negotiations, power doesn't always come from tariffs, threats, or economic pressure. Sometimes power comes from understanding the rules better than the person trying to use them. Today, we're breaking down the clause Trump's team helped create, the safeguard Canada quietly relied on, and why the trade showdown many people expected may never have been what it appeared to be. But before we continue, if you enjoy deep geopolitical analysis, trade strategy breakdowns, and the global power shifts shaping today's world, make sure you subscribe to GeoWar Brief and turn on notifications so you never miss our next report. Now, let's get into it. For months, public discussion surrounding the USMCA, known in Canada as CUSMA, was built around one central assumption. People believed July 1st was a hard deadline. A date capable of reshaping North American trade, a date that handed Washington enormous leverage and forced Canada into a defensive position. The assumption spread because it sounded reasonable. After all, the agreement officially entered into force on July 1st, 2020. 6 years later, the deal requires a formal review. Many people heard the phrase review date and immediately interpreted it as an expiration date. Politicians reinforced the confusion, commentators repeated it, headlines simplified it, and over time, a scheduled review gradually transformed into what looked like a countdown toward a crisis. Yet the actual agreement tells a very different story. Its legal structure was built around continuity, not collapse. And that distinction matters far more than most people realize. Because when negotiators believe a clock is running out, everything changes. Pressure increases. Concessions become easier to demand. Urgency begins driving decisions. Deadlines create anxiety, and anxiety creates leverage. But what happens when the deadline isn't actually a deadline? What happens when the date everyone is watching doesn't determine whether the agreement survives? Suddenly, the psychology changes. The urgency changes. The leverage changes. And that appears to be exactly what happened. While Washington continued emphasizing July 1st as a moment of maximum pressure, Canada's behavior suggested officials viewed the situation very differently. Rather than rushing toward a deal at any cost, Canada spent months expanding its options. Trade diversification accelerated. International partnerships grew. Economic cooperation with Europe received greater attention. Defense relationships deepened. Supply chain resilience became a major national priority. At the time, many observers viewed these actions as preparation for a worst-case scenario. But what if they were preparing for something else entirely? What if Canadian planners understood that the review process would provide years of additional negotiating space? What if they knew the agreement would continue operating even without an immediate breakthrough? If that's true, it changes the entire story, because it means Canada was never negotiating from the vulnerable position many assumed. It means Mark Carney may have entered this confrontation with far more confidence than the public realized, and it means some of Canada's strongest advantages were never announced at press conferences. They were embedded directly into the agreement itself, and that's where the story becomes even more fascinating, because the protection Canada appears to be relying on today was never originally designed to protect Canada. It was designed to protect American interests. To understand how that happened, we need to go back to the negotiations that created the agreement in the first place, because that's where the real story begins. When Donald Trump entered his first term, one of his biggest economic priorities was replacing NAFTA. He repeatedly argued that the old agreement disadvantaged American workers and weakened the United States' bargaining position. His administration wanted a new deal. But not just a new deal. They wanted a framework that would preserve American leverage long after the agreement was signed. That objective shaped nearly every major discussion during the negotiations. American negotiators weren't simply trying to create updated trade rules. They were trying to build a system that would force future negotiations to happen. The concern in Washington was straightforward. Permanent agreements eventually reduce leverage. Businesses adapt, supply chains become deeply integrated, economic relationships stabilize, political pressure becomes less effective. Eventually, the agreement stops feeling temporary and becomes part of everyday economic reality. The Trump administration wanted to prevent that outcome. They wanted leverage that could be renewed. They wanted future negotiating opportunities built directly into the structure of the deal. And that's where the famous sunset clause entered the conversation. At the time, the idea looked powerful. Instead of creating an agreement that could continue indefinitely without review, the United States pushed for a framework requiring regular evaluations. The logic was simple. Every review would create another opportunity to demand changes. Every review would bring Canada and Mexico back to the negotiating table. Every review would reinforce the idea that continued access to the North American market depended on cooperation. From Washington's perspective, it was a strategic innovation. From Canada's perspective, it was a risk that needed careful management. Eventually, both sides reached a compromise, and that compromise became Article 34.7. Now here's the detail that changes everything. The clause was designed to create recurring negotiations. It was not designed to trigger automatic collapse. That sounds like a technical difference. But in reality, it's the difference that reshapes the entire debate. Because an automatic expiration would create a genuine cliff edge. A recurring review process creates something completely different. It creates continuity. It creates time. And most importantly, it creates a framework that remains active while negotiations continue, which means the same mechanism designed to create leverage also limits the ability of any government to create immediate disruption. Put simply, the clause that allows Washington to apply pressure is also the clause preventing the agreement from disappearing overnight, and that balance wasn't accidental. The architects of the agreement understood something important. Modern North American supply chains are deeply interconnected. Cars cross borders multiple times during production. Energy systems are linked. Agricultural markets depend on stable rules. Manufacturers rely on predictable access. Aerospace industries depend on components moving seamlessly between countries. The economic network is simply too integrated to tolerate sudden legal collapse without significant consequences. The negotiators understood that. The lawyers understood that. Businesses understood that. And increasingly, it appears Canada built much of its strategy around that reality. Because there's a massive difference between negotiating under the threat of immediate collapse and negotiating with the expectation that the process will continue. In one scenario, panic becomes possible. In the other, patience becomes an option. And patience may be the most important clue in this entire story. Because for more than a year, Washington emphasized urgency, yet Canada consistently emphasized preparation. And that difference may reveal who truly understood the rules from the very beginning. For months, Washington's messaging revolved around one central idea: urgency. The deadline was approaching. The consequences were coming. The pressure was building. And yet Canada's response never matched the level of alarm many expected. Mark Carney never behaved like a leader facing an unavoidable economic cliff. Instead, he behaved like someone preparing for a process that would continue well beyond the date dominating the headlines. That difference explains far more than most people realize. When governments genuinely fear immediate disruption, they usually move fast. They prioritize certainty. They pursue quick agreements. They focus on short-term stability above almost everything else. But Canada appeared to choose a different path. Rather than concentrating solely on July 1st, Ottawa spent months strengthening its position for what might come afterward. International partnerships expanded, alternative trade opportunities received greater attention, strategic industries became a larger priority, supply chain security moved closer to the center of economic planning, critical mineral investments accelerated, defense cooperation increased. At first glance, these developments looked unrelated. Each announcement seemed like its own story. Each initiative appeared to stand on its own. But when viewed together, a different picture begins to emerge. A picture of preparation, a picture of flexibility, a picture of a government creating options before entering a prolonged negotiation. And options matter, because in any major negotiation, dependence weakens leverage, alternatives strengthen leverage. The more options you have, the less pressure your opponent can apply. And over the last 18 months, Canada appears to have focused heavily on expanding those options. That's why many analysts have started revisiting the agreement itself, because once the legal structure becomes clear, Canada's behavior begins making much more sense. The review process wasn't designed to force an immediate decision. It was designed to begin a conversation. And that distinction changes everything. Think about it this way. Imagine two different scenarios. In the first scenario, an agreement automatically disappears on a specific date unless all parties approve a renewal. That's a hard deadline. That's a cliff edge. That's a situation where every day closer to the deadline increases pressure. Now imagine a second scenario. The agreement remains active while discussions continue. Reviews take place. Negotiations continue. Disagreements emerge. But the framework itself stays in place. That's a very different environment. The pressure still exists, but it works differently. Time becomes available. Preparation becomes possible. Patience becomes valuable. And that appears to be exactly the environment Canada believed it was operating in, which raises another important question. If Canadian officials understood this reality, why did so much public discussion continue focusing on July 1st as though it were a point of no return? The answer may lie in the psychology of negotiations, because major negotiations are rarely fought on just one battlefield. There is the negotiation happening behind closed doors, and there is the negotiation happening in public. Sometimes the public negotiation becomes almost as important as the private one, because perception influences behavior. If businesses believe uncertainty is increasing, investment decisions change. If markets believe a major disruption is approaching, expectations shift. If political leaders believe pressure is rising, they may become more willing to compromise. In other words, the perception of risk can create consequences long before actual risk appears. And that's why narratives matter. For more than a year, Washington's narrative emphasized urgency. The clock was ticking. The review date was approaching. Decisions had to be made. Consequences were coming. The message was repeated often enough that many people simply accepted it. But Canada's actions suggested officials were operating under a very different set of assumptions. Look at what actually happened. There was no visible rush toward a dramatic concession. There was no public panic. There was no scramble to secure a quick political victory at any cost. Instead, Canada focused on resilience. Officials spoke repeatedly about diversification. They emphasized strategic industries. They discussed strengthening partnerships. They highlighted reducing vulnerabilities. Those are not typically the priorities of a government expecting immediate collapse. Those are the priorities of a government preparing for a long contest. And that brings us directly to Mark Carney, because understanding Canada's position requires understanding the way Carney approaches risk. Throughout his career, whether in central banking, finance, or public service, Carney has consistently emphasized preparation over reaction. The objective is not to predict every possible outcome. The objective is to remain prepared for multiple outcomes. That philosophy appears throughout Canada's current trade strategy. If negotiations succeed quickly, Canada benefits. If reviews continue for years, Canada adapts. If uncertainty remains, Canada adjusts. If new challenges emerge, alternatives already exist. Notice the pattern. Every path leads back to preparation. Every path leads back to flexibility. Every path reduces dependence on a single outcome. And that may be one of the most important lessons hidden within Article 34.7. The clause doesn't eliminate uncertainty. It transforms uncertainty. Instead of asking whether the agreement survives July 1st, the more meaningful question becomes what happens after July 1st. Because once that becomes the focus, the entire discussion begins to look different. Washington's leverage starts looking different. Canada's strategy starts looking different. Even the public narrative starts looking different. And that's where the story becomes significantly more interesting. Because once it becomes clear that July 1st was never truly a cliff edge, another question naturally emerges. If the agreement was never actually at risk of disappearing on that date, why was so much effort spent convincing people that it might? That question takes us deeper into the mechanics of power, because leverage only works when the threat behind it is credible. Deadlines only create pressure when people believe those deadlines truly matter, and political messaging only shapes behavior when people accept the underlying assumptions. What happens when those assumptions begin to break down? What happens when the public starts realizing the situation may not be what it seemed? Suddenly, the battle shifts. The focus moves away from the deadline itself and toward the narrative surrounding the deadline. Who understood the agreement correctly? Who misread the situation? Who gained time? And who benefited most from that time? Those questions are becoming increasingly important because while public attention remained focused on tariffs and trade disputes, Ottawa appears to have been pursuing several long-term objectives simultaneously. Critical mineral partnerships expanded, defense cooperation deepened, energy discussions intensified, infrastructure planning accelerated, trade relationships beyond North America received greater attention. Viewed individually, each initiative appeared important. Viewed collectively, they appeared transformative. Together, they pointed toward one clear objective: reducing vulnerability. Because the less dependent Canada becomes on any single outcome, the stronger its negotiating position becomes. That principle applies to trade. It applies to energy. It applies to defense. It applies to investment. Dependence weakens leverage. Options strengthen leverage. And Canada appears determined to keep expanding its options. But here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Because over the past several months, something subtle has started changing in Ottawa's messaging. Not the objectives, the language. And that distinction matters, because people often mistake a change in language for a change in strategy, when in reality, the strategy may remain exactly the same. Canada still wants stability. Canada still wants predictable trade rules. Canada still wants long-term certainty. Canada still wants relief from economic pressure. Those goals have remained remarkably consistent. What has changed is how those goals are being presented. Increasingly, Canadian officials have begun framing the conversation through the lens of strategic competition. Not competition between Canada and the United States, but competition between North America and the rest of the world. And that subtle shift could have major implications, because it transforms the discussion from a disagreement over trade terms into a conversation about shared interests. Suddenly, Canadian energy is no longer just a Canadian resource. It becomes a North American advantage. Canadian critical minerals are no longer simply exports. They become strategic assets. Canadian manufacturing capacity becomes part of a broader continental supply chain strategy. And once the conversation moves in that direction, the negotiation starts looking very different from how it appeared a year ago. Because the real battle may no longer be about whether the agreement survives. The real battle may be about who controls the narrative surrounding what comes next, and that is where the story becomes even more consequential. Now, another important question begins to emerge. If Canada spent the last 18 months preparing for a prolonged negotiation rather than an immediate crisis, what exactly was it preparing for? The answer may reveal more about Ottawa's expectations than any public statement ever could, because governments rarely reveal their true assumptions directly. Instead, they reveal them through their actions. And Canada's actions have been remarkably consistent. Look at the pattern. Investment in strategic industries increased. Critical mineral partnerships expanded. Defense cooperation deepened. Energy security became a recurring priority. Trade relationships outside North America received greater focus. Infrastructure planning accelerated. At the time, many of these developments were treated as separate stories, separate announcements, separate policy decisions, separate headlines, but viewed together, they tell a much larger story. Canada was building flexibility, not because it expected the agreement to disappear, but because it expected uncertainty to continue. And uncertainty is very different from collapse. Collapse demands emergency action. Uncertainty rewards preparation. Collapse forces reaction. Uncertainty creates opportunities for strategy. That distinction helps explain why Ottawa's behavior often appeared so different from the public narrative surrounding the negotiations. While many people focused on the possibility of a sudden confrontation, Canada appeared focused on strengthening its position regardless of how the confrontation unfolded. That approach reflects a simple principle. The strongest negotiating position is often the one least dependent on a specific outcome. And over the last 18 months, Canada appears to have worked aggressively toward that goal, which brings us back to the most important element in this entire story: time. Because time may have been Canada's greatest advantage all along. Time allowed preparation, time allowed diversification, time allowed new partnerships to emerge, time allowed vulnerabilities to be reduced, time allowed leverage to grow, and perhaps most importantly, time allowed Canada to avoid negotiating from a position of panic. That is a significant advantage in any high-stakes dispute. Because panic narrows options, preparation expands them. The more prepared you are, the harder it becomes for external pressure to force unwanted concessions. And that seems to be one of the central lessons hidden beneath months of headlines and political rhetoric. The real story may not be that Canada discovered a legal safeguard. The real story may be that Canada used that safeguard to gain something even more valuable: breathing room. Enough breathing room to strengthen its position while much of the public remained focused on a deadline that never carried the consequences many believed it did. And that realization changes how recent events should be understood. For more than a year, public attention revolved around July 1st. The countdown dominated discussions. The date became the centerpiece of countless headlines. The assumption was simple: everything depended on what happened when the clock ran out. But what if that assumption was wrong? What if July 1st was never the end of the story? What if it was merely the beginning of a new phase? Because that's increasingly what the evidence suggests. The review process was never designed to create an immediate collapse. It was designed to create continuing negotiations, continuing discussions, continuing opportunities to revisit the agreement. And once that becomes clear, the strategic landscape looks very different. Washington's leverage looks different. Canada's confidence looks different. The entire dispute looks different. Instead of a race against time, it becomes a contest over positioning. Instead of a single decisive deadline, it becomes a long-term struggle over influence. Instead of asking who wins on July 1st, the more relevant question becomes who enters the next phase in the stronger position. And that question may explain much of what we've witnessed over the last 18 months. Because while public attention remained focused on rhetoric, deadlines, and political drama, both sides were preparing for what comes next. The difference is that one side appeared to treat the date as a pressure point. The other appeared to treat it as a checkpoint. One side emphasized urgency. The other emphasized preparation. One side focused on the deadline itself. The other focused on the environment that would exist after the deadline passed. And as the review date arrives, that distinction is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Which brings us to perhaps the biggest takeaway from this entire story. Power is not always about economic size. It is not always about tariffs. It is not always about political pressure. Sometimes power comes from understanding the framework better than everyone else. Sometimes power comes from recognizing opportunities hidden inside the rules. And sometimes the most effective strategy is not resisting pressure. It's understanding exactly how much pressure actually exists. That appears to be the lesson Canada learned. And it may be the reason Mark Carney remained so calm while much of the public conversation grew increasingly dramatic. Because leaders who believe they are approaching a cliff tend to behave differently. They rush, they react, they seek immediate certainty. Canada largely did the opposite. It prepared. It diversified, it expanded options, and it positioned itself for a negotiation that could continue long after the headlines moved on. Whether that strategy ultimately succeeds remains to be seen. Trade disputes are rarely simple. Political pressures remain real, tariffs remain real, economic uncertainty remains real. None of those challenges disappear, but the idea that everything depended on a single date now appears increasingly difficult to defend, because the agreement was built to continue. The review process was built to continue, and the negotiations themselves were built to continue, which means the most important developments may not occur before July 1st. They may occur afterward, when the headlines fade, when the countdown ends, and when the next phase of North America's trade relationship truly begins. The question is no longer whether the agreement survives. The question is who used the time available most effectively. And if recent events are any indication, that answer may shape North American trade for years to come. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want more in-depth analysis on global power struggles, trade wars, geopolitical strategy, and the hidden forces shaping world events, subscribe to GeoWar Brief, turn on notifications, and join us for our next report. Because in geopolitics, the biggest stories are often the ones hiding behind the headlines.